Good morning and welcome everybody to KYMEA's second Community IRP Focus Group, and thank you for attending. Your participation and feedback are very valuable to KYMEA and the IRP process. Our President and CEO, Doug Bursch, along with staff, will begin with presentations. At noon, we will take an hour break and return at 1 p.m. The afternoon sessions will not be a repeat of the morning sessions, but will be a continuation of morning topics. We will conclude the meeting with a Q&A and public comment session. To reduce technology glitches throughout the meeting, participant microphones will be muted throughout the webinar. Please send any questions you may have to Heather Overby via the WebEx chat feature. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And welcome to everyone. I'm going to do some quick introductions and kind of lay out what we're going to do this morning and this afternoon for everybody so they can kind of plan for the day. First of all, I'd like to introduce the KYMEA IRP team. I'm Doug Bursch. I'm the president and CEO. Heather Overby is our vice president, finance and accounting, and our CFO. Rob Leesman, vice president, market analytics. And Michelle Hickson, who you've already met, is our Director of Administrative Services and Communications. So this is a team that will be presenting today, the team that's working on the IRP, and we'll talk a little more about different aspects of what everybody does as they get into it and do their presentations. From our previous agenda that took place on June 24th of this year, this is our first session of our IRP Community Focus Group agenda. And I want to quickly go over that previous agenda just to kind of, for people that weren't able to attend, you'll know what was covered. This information's up on the website. Michelle's going to talk about that later. So if you missed it, you want to get caught up, there's materials up there. And there's other things like a video of today's session is going to be up there and last session's up there. So last time we went through the same welcome introductions and we talked about the IRP approach. How do we approach an integrated resource plan? We talked about the website. That was very new at the time, so we wanted to introduce the participants of how to maneuver and across that website. The IRP process. This is a process that we'll talk about again today. It's important to understand the steps that we go through to create the IRP. Rate making and pro forma. So an integrated resource plan has to do with production costs and loads and demand side management and those types of things, but it trickles down to rate making. How do we set the rates for the members? And pro forma, how do we have financial stability and solvency as part of each of our plans? It's very important to make good, wise investments. We talked about transmission before, and we'll talk about transmission again, and that has to do with both delivery to our members across the LG&E system, which we're a transmission member of, and also delivery from the MISO market. So this is an established market that we tie to up in Indiana and parts of Kentucky. There are what's called a regional transmission operator, an RTO, and that allows us to buy from an established market with transparent market prices. We talked about technologies before. These are technologies that we're feeding through the model. And then we had a Q&A. In the afternoon session, we talked more about technologies, and that had to do with reciprocating engines, solar technology, battery storage, combined cycle technology, and the like. That gave us a flavor for the different possibilities. That's developed our potential portfolios. We talked about a zero carbon emissions scenario that we'll touch on today. Uncertainties that we're going to introduce. So we take our portfolios and we say, we don't know the future, but we want to see how uncertainties affect them. And then we had a second Q&A. This meeting, we're going to switch gears a little bit and dig into more of the results. So we laid the groundwork back in June. We've done a lot of work from June to now, and we want to touch base and get everybody up to speed of where we're at. We'll again go through our website. For those of you who haven't seen the website, you'll get an idea of what that looks like, the process and approach. Investments are an important topic. If we invest in a long-term PPA, or if we invest and borrow money and invest in assets, they'll both have very similar ramifications that Heather's going to talk about. Rob's going to touch on operational concerns. and considerations. When we operate our system, when someone flips the light switch, electricity has to flow and be there. When they flip it off, again, they don't need the electricity. And it's that operational considerations and the types of resources and responses we have to have adequate supply, reliable supply, is something we need to consider in any plan. We're going to talk about lessons of California. So California has been often referred to as a canary in the coal mine. They'll do things before perhaps the rest of the country, and there's times we can observe what's going on in California and get a preview of what it would look like in this part of the country. The decision time frame is the next piece of, we have near-term decisions, longer-term decisions. The longer-term ones perhaps aren't going to be made right now, but they're considerations for the future. We've issued what we call an indicative RFP that Rob's going to go through, request for proposals to see what kind of resources are out there and what kind of mixes we could look at, what are the potential resources, and how we scored those is our RFP scoring criteria. That'll bring us to lunchtime. There will be a Q&A that you'll be able to type in your questions to a chat, and we'll respond to those. A break for lunch, and then come back at 1 o'clock. This afternoon, we'll go through the modeling process, how we look at a national market, the various portfolios that we're considering, the results of those portfolios. These are preliminary results, uncertainty, how that gets applied to these results, the balancing of cost and risk, and then an action plan. The nice thing about being public power is this outreach to our community. We appreciate you taking the time out and being on the call today. We've had a number of feedbacks through the last couple of weeks that we take under consideration and try to understand the public's concerns and the things they're looking at. Certainly, we need to balance cost and risk and environment and all the things we're going to talk about today. So thank you for joining us and being part of this group. That brings us to Michelle and website.
Thank you, Doug. So our goal in designing the IRP pages of the website was to provide education as well as an outlet for transparency through this IRP process. We hope that this tool is useful to our members and also our members' customers. I provided some slides here to show you how to navigate through the website and highlight a few of the features on each page. So you'll see here the IRP homepage. It just gives you a little bit about an IRP. What is an IRP? Why are we doing an IRP? And that's very important, especially for those who maybe don't understand it, and it's a refresher for those that do. Next, we have our IRP roadmap timeline. So the roadmap timeline is an interactive timeline. You can kind of scroll through there, grab the timeline, and move it left and right. What that does is allows you to see several months of our future goals and deadlines. It also shows on this page at the bottom the IRP focus groups that were held over the past couple of months. Of course, this is our last community IRP focus group, and we do want to thank all of those who have participated for taking the time to attend and for providing valuable feedback via the feedback form on the website, which I will show you here shortly. Then we've got participant resources on the website. Of course, public participation is encouraged, and that's why we provided this outlet today and the feedback form on the website. And it is a significant element throughout the IRP process. This page contains PDFs of the presentation, so you'll see links under presentations that takes you to the PDFs. You can feel free to download those. It also has the feedback form, or the feedback, whatever feedback was sent to us, whatever questions were asked at the previous IRP community focus group, that is located there too. You can click those, download them. It may answer some questions that you have. And then we've also got links to the videos, the morning and the afternoon videos from the previous IRP focus group. And of course that was in June, and so you can download those, you can watch them, and they are quite lengthy, but it'll give you a greater understanding of the process up to this point. And then we've got IRP facts. So this is just we've compiled several frequently asked questions, and you're free to review through each one of those on the website. And then, of course, your feedback is important to us, and so we're showing the IRP feedback form here. We want you to go to our website. We have received several feedback forms submitted already, and we want continue feedback. So we thank you for that, and hope that you'll tell us how we did today.
Good morning. For those of you who haven't had a chance to go to the website yet and do a little bit of referencing on what an IRP actually is, we thought we'd go through the process and review it for everyone on exactly how we look at the IRP process and what our focus is on this. So we're going to just run through the whole process and how that we look at it and our take on this. So you've got this is the agenda. And I know that I have actually already had a request to put the agenda out on the website or email it to participants. Michelle, can that be put on the website or emailed to participants? Michelle is going to take care of that, and we'll let you know how that's resolved by the end of my two presentations. So the Integrated Resource Plan, this is where it is, of course, on the agenda. And what is this? It's a roadmap. It's a roadmap of where we're going. Why do we do an integrated resource plan, and actually what is it? So IRPs answer the questions of, as an agency, how are we going to plan for our resource needs? Obviously, that's done with a considerable amount of due diligence. It's not done in a week. It's certainly not done in a month. It's a very long and very detailed process that we take very seriously and do a great amount of due diligence on. What goes into that? First, we're going to look at load. What do we need to have to serve our members? Load growth is going to be there. Communities are going to grow, hopefully, and so just the natural load is going to grow. We've got demand. How much are we going to spike there? What's our maximum that we're going to need in any 1 hour to provide to our members? That's different than load growth. Load growth would be like how many hours and how much energy over the whole course of a year, maybe that or a month, that our members use. But then those demand, that peak, is when it spikes really quick, 1 hour. We have to provide for that. And we have to plan to be able to meet that need. The load shape, hourly. How much do we think that our members are going to use? And it's a very detailed process over a very long period of time. And we need to know every single hour what our forecast is based on weather and COVID or other mitigating factors, and how our load and the needs of our members are going to change. Demand response, energy efficiency. As our members start to employ that and their ratepayers start to employ that, how's that going to change those hourly needs? Everyone is very interested in that demand response and energy efficiency. So we need to put that into the inputs. Distributed generation. What about rooftop solar? If as communities get more interested in that and customers get more interested in that, how is that going to affect our load? So we put all of these in and try to really think of every scenario that could affect how much energy our members need from us. And then you've got other future considerations, like our existing portfolio. This is kind of how are we going to meet those demands? Well, we need to look at, do we have assets what's the useful life of those assets? We don't currently have any, but you still need to build that in to the portfolio model. What about our purchase power agreements? How long are they? What are the terms of those contracts? Can we blend and extend some of them? Can we get out of them? Whatever. However they're going to serve us. Technologies. What's available right now and in really good condition for us to use it? What's applicable right now? What do we think is going to change in the next 10, 15, 20 years? What's going to change and become more viable It's going to become cheaper perhaps, and it's going to become more technology savvy. It's going to grow in technology. So we need to be aware of all of those things. We don't live in a bubble. We certainly do not think that technology is going to stay stagnant. And we're of the belief that if you put your head in the sand and just embrace old technologies, that you're going to be left behind. And that's not us. So we embrace new technologies, and we want to build those considerations into how we're going to serve our members. Market intelligence surveys. A little bit of that goes with the technology, but also what are other people in the industry thinking about just how the whole market is, weather conditions, what are other people forecasting for weather, load, environmental changes, all of that market intelligence. Where do people think that power prices are going to go? Where do they think capacity is going to go? All of that is built in, and we use market surveys and market intelligence very extensively from a variety of different sources. The EIA, the Energy Administration, EIA. I can't think of it at the moment, but never mind. If you're really interested in what EIA stands for, email me and I will get you that answer. Okay, so state and federal regulatory requirements. Obviously, if Kentucky or any of our members were to be in a state or federal regulatory environment where they had a renewable requirement or any other kind of carbon requirements, obviously those types of considerations would go into our inputs. Transmission, what's transmission going to do? What kind of effects do we think those transmission prices are going to have on our portfolio? Transmission is a huge consideration for us. The escalation of those prices is a huge consideration for us. And so we want to build those assumptions into models and not have our head in the sand about where we think those prices are going to go and how we're going to mitigate that. Siting. If we were to say that maybe we wanted to perhaps construct a generation asset, where would that be? Is it going to be in Heather's backyard? Well, maybe not. I don't have a backyard. So, but is it going to be in the Walmart parking lot? Probably not. But we need to know where that siting is going to be. Permitting, that goes along with siting, obviously. Congestion, curtailment risk. Congestion is a concept that a lot of people forget about. And since we transact in the MISO transmission market and the PJM transmission markets, there's something called transmission. And it's a concept where we have to, let's say we had a resource that was in a certain district or a certain place at MISO. The way the transmission markets work, and I may be getting into the weeds, but I want to explain the concept of transmission or congestion. We have to liquidate it right there. That means we have to sell the energy right there at that node. And then we buy it at the node where we're going to take it and pull it into the KU transmission system. There's a difference in those prices, and it's the congestion that's on that line. And if you forget about that concept and you forget about that aspect of the market price, the locational market price there, you're going to put yourself up for a huge risk. It's a very big financial risk there. I've seen transmission or congestion be $10 a megawatt hour at one point. It needs to be into any kind of considerations that you have, because it can sneak up and cost you millions of dollars really quick in a month. Now that I've scared everybody about transmission congestion. Okay, so what else? Market commodity pricing. Where do we think gas is going to go? Where do we think oil prices, coal, everything? That all goes into all of our considerations. That would also go into any kind of construction considerations we put. Where do we think the price of steel is going to be? What are the prices that we're getting from vendors good on any kind of assets that we could be constructing? All other sensitivities, there's a million, I'm sure that Doug could tell you about that he puts in. But we want to build in as many sensitivities as we can and plan for as many scenarios as we can. Scenarios, this to me gets to sensitivities relate to scenarios. Scenarios are things that just happen that you cannot control. Plans are what you do in response to those scenarios. And so we take that very, very seriously. And of course, member input. We love to get all of the member input from the website, and we do read it all. Every single staff member at KYMEA gets a copy of all member input, and we take that extremely seriously, both from the website responses and from our board members. Output. Diversity. Obviously, we want a diverse portfolio. If you have all of your eggs in one basket, whether it's your personal financial situation, whether it's your personal income situation, or if it's your power supplier, you don't want all your eggs in one basket. And I think we all know the value of diversity in your own stock portfolio, and it's the same for power supply. If one technology or one generation mix or generation source starts to go bad, you do not want all your eggs in that basket. And we recognize that. We want to be able to pivot very quickly, as quickly as you can in the power supply, and we take that very seriously. We have a grading matrix that we're going to discuss on the output and how we grade each plan in response to scenarios. And then, of course, we have presentations that will be available and our integrated resource plan. And then we'll have some changes. I mean, we'll have some recommendations and some changes, and we embrace that. Okay, so final actions on this. We will have final recommendations for the board. The staff does not make the final decision on this. We make recommendations based on our best professional judgment. That's what the board's hired us to do. So we will have our recommendation to the board, and we will have a formal report. The KYMEA board will make any decisions and have approvals. And then, of course, we will do requests for proposals in response to any board action that may take place. Okay, so here's a beautiful process outline and flow chart here. It's exactly the same one that was used in the prior session in June. So you've got all of your inputs going in, and then you've got your bunch of scenarios like the base of energy, high gas prices, low gas prices, carbon limits with high gas, carbon limits with low gas, carbon tax, zero carbon additions only. Let's stick them all in there into our beautiful Encompass software that is extremely powerful. And then I'm assuming that little head is Doug and Rob and Michelle and myself, even though there's only one head. And it all goes in, and then it spits out into where we are now, which is our initial results. And of course, you'll see that into the brain went all our community input, which we value very, very, very seriously. And our input also, the community input also goes into our initial results. And you can see that that's where we are because we put a big, beautiful red circle around it. And so the next step will be the final report sometime maybe in the Q4 of 2020, Q1 of 2021 timeframe, in that timeframe. And then, of course, the board approval. So that concludes our process overview. And now we're going to go right into the concept of our investments and our debt equivalency. And I know everyone's really excited about this because it's nerdy in accounting and finance. Okay, so of course, here's where we are on the agenda. Let me go back. Okay, so utilities, basically, two options for long-term planning and long-term generation, and how do we meet our members' needs in a long-term horizon. I'm not talking about a very short-term horizon of going out into the market and satisfying any fluctuations in our real-time projections. I'm talking about how do we plan for the next 10, 20 years. We don't want things to jump up and scare us and surprise us. So you have two choices. You can either build an asset and finance that with bonds, tax-exempt bonds, or you can do a purchase power agreement. Now, and of course, those two things can take many different variations. And so we're just going to talk generally about the similarities and differences in those two options. So you're going to build generation. Okay, so what's this option look like? You're going to finance it with bonds, you're going to build it, and you're going to own it and run it. Okay, so you've got financial risk there. You've got a long-term debt on your balance sheet. It's a long-term debt obligation. You've got principal and interest payments that go with that. You've got construction risk. Well, maybe you'll have a cost overrun. You know, maybe steel goes up. Maybe something gets stuck in China and it's stuck through customs. There's lots of things that could go on and cause a cost overrun. Operating risk. Maybe the asset doesn't perform the way you thought it was going to. Maybe suddenly the technology that you invested in becomes very obsolescent. There's all of those operating risks. You've also got, of course, ongoing operating and maintenance expenses. And the liability is shown on your balance sheet. And of course, the interest expense is shown on your income statement. Okay, purchase power agreements. It's a contract. It's a long-term contract. Could be short-term, but we're talking about long-term here. There is a long-term financial obligation associated with a purchase power agreement. If you do a 20-year agreement with someone, most likely you're going to have a fixed payment in there, and that fixed payment could be part of the payment each month. It could be the entire part of the entire payment every month. If it was a portion, it could be a capacity equivalent. It could be a take-or-pay contract where you have to take all of the output from this plant, whether or not you use it, and pay for it. We currently do not have any take-or-pay energy contracts at KYMEA, but they do exist. It could have variable payments in there also. If you had just the capacity fixed payment, you might have an operating cost. Some of our PPAs have an operating cost associated with them, fuel cost associated with it, and it's just kind of those are optional in how the agreement is structured, and so but they could be there, especially if you're buying capacity only and you've got to pay for the energy somehow, and those prices are usually not fixed for 20 years. You've got counterparty risk. What if you did an agreement with Joe Blow Co-op to purchase 20 years of electricity from them, and they declare bankruptcy? Yeah, you've got liquidated damages, but good luck on collecting that. So you need to really look very, very closely at your counterparty risk, and any margins that or collateral that's posted, or any letters of credit that are posted, only take you so far. And all of this is the important thing with a purchase power agreement. Every bit of that is going to be shown as an expense on your income statement. So that's how it differs from asset ownership. Even though you might have the same amount of monthly fixed payments, one of them is reducing a liability, and one of them is showing up as an expense on your income statement. So, how do the credit rating agencies view these two things? This is what it comes down to. This is what it's important. Let me say this very clearly. All three major credit rating agencies, Moody's, Fitch, S&P, treat utility commitments under a purchase power agreement as a substitute for debt-financed capital investments when assessing financial risk. All three agree that PPAs expose the buyer to uncertainty surrounding the cost recovery of a long-term financial commitment, except that it is not reflected as debt on the balance sheet. Okay, so what do those words mean? That's a bunch of financial Heather speak. So let's break that down. That means that if you were looking at KYMEA and you were wanting to make a credit decision on us, how credit worthy is KYMEA? And we only had purchase power agreements like we do now. If you looked just at our financial statements and did not read the notes, a lot of people don't go through and read the notes of the audited financial statements, you would see our balance sheet, PPAs, nowhere on there. You would see our income statement. You would see the expenses for those PPAs. but you would not know about the fixed portion that we have to pay for the next 20 years in some instances, and that we're going to have to pay for the next 20 years. You're not going to know about that because it's not on the balance sheet. It's not listed as a liability. So it's kind of hidden. It's a long-term commitment, but it's hidden on the balance. It's hidden on the financials, and that's it's kind of risky unless you were to go through and look at the notes. Always read the notes on audited financial statements. So what does this mean? That's called debt equivalency. That's the term for that. It means that we need to achieve comparability between looking at an agency like KYMEA that currently does not have any fixed assets or fixed generation assets and does not have any debt and buys everything through a purchase power agreement. We need to take that kind of agency and compare it apples to apples to an agency that has elected to construct assets. So you've got to be able to look at those things, and really they are very comparable. So a large portfolio of PPAs and a large portfolio of debt have very similar effects on credit worthiness. You've got to be able to make those payments, but sometimes they're hidden. So let's do a summary of this really quick. So asset construction and PPAs have a lot of similarities, and they've got some differences. And all of that should be considered. And really it comes down to your risk tolerance and the cost of the deal. That's really what it comes down to. And that's going to help you make your best decision in which to choose. So this chart kind of goes through, it kind of summarizes the aspects of each. Both of them have financial risk, long-term financial risk. You could have some possible operating risks with a purchase power agreement because it might be built into the contract. You will have operating risk with an asset construction. You could have operating expenses if it's built into the PPA, but you will have operating expenses, of course, if you own the asset. Possible maintenance expenses, like I said, and then maintenance expenses, of course, with asset. Purchase power agreements, you're going to have counterparty risk. You've got to know who you're dealing with. Also, in a purchase power agreement, the owner of that asset that you're buying power from is not giving you that power because they're your best friend and they want to do you a favor. They want a return on that investment. So you're going to pay that in the deal. So they want a certain return on that investment. They invested in an asset instead of putting that money into the market or into a savings account or some other financial instrument. And so they want a return on that investment, and you're going to pay it. Conversely, if you own the investment, you should expect a return on it somehow, either maybe through the transmission market. If you happen to be in one of the transmission markets, that would be great. You would get something there, or throughout. You're going to get a return on that investment, so that would be income. In a purchase power agreement, everything's on the income statement. If you do own the asset, we've got on here income statement and balance sheet because, of course, any kind of interest payments are going to show up as interest expense on your income statement, and the liability for any bonds would be on your balance sheet. There will be construction risk, of course, if you build the asset, and there would be, but you would own the asset at the end of the day. So if the useful life exceeds the term of the bonds, you've got a really cheap asset there for the life of that asset. So that concludes my portion. And I think we're up for Rob.
Good morning. I'm going to talk about the operational considerations that we're looking at when we're conducting this RFP and ultimately the IRP. The first thing that we're going to talk about is pretty much the golden rule for anybody that manages transmission and or generation, and that's reliability. And in the basic sense, reliability is the ability for power generation and transmission capacity to meet peak demand. That's ultra important. When you go home and you hit that light switch, you want your lights to come on, and that's kind of what all this is about. In fact, we're subject to an annual requirement with NERC to submit 10-year forecast. It's called NERC Mod 32, which tells them where we predict our future peaks to be at each delivery point. So they take this very serious, reliability-wise. And in fact, we also have to submit summer and winter prep documents to CERC. CERC is the Eastern Reliability Council. So that they maintain the grid that, where we're at inside of LG and EKU. Reliability is also, addresses, variability in generation and load. So, when you talk about load, what can happen when you have odd weather events? Well, we're only 6.5 years removed from the polar vortex, and we saw, what happened with load. Super cold, and really we got to a point where things were at a tipping point of one or two more units going offline. We would have had widespread blackouts. So this is why the reliability and making sure that the infrastructure is there is ultra important. And obviously, as we as the technologies get better and more renewables come into the system, we get that intermittency with that as well. So there's an ebb and flow kind of tug of war, making sure that you can meet these demands when called upon. And you also have to stay within frequency. Frequency obviously for us is 60 hertz, and there's meters out there that monitor this, and if the frequencies drag to a certain point, circuits will start getting taken offline, because if you don't, it just becomes a domino effect essentially, and it just gets worse and worse. So there's set points for these relays. That 60 hertz is ultimately where they want to be, and I don't recall the exact numbers, but there's set points on these meters that loads will start being curtailed if they get exceeded. And we also obviously have to stay within a certain voltage range. You can't go home and plug a light into an outlet that's 100 volts and it's rated for 120. Obviously has detrimental effects to equipment, especially as we get newer technologies that are very sensitive to voltages. The next thing I want to talk about is contingencies, and specifically, what are the risks? So when we look at a contingency, obviously that's the unexpected failure or an outage of some piece of equipment. Be it a generator, a transmission line, circuit breaker, or some other element that's going to restrict flow of electricity. As you see there in this little picture, this is from a tornado. So I mean, these things do happen, and they are unexpected, but we have to be able to deal with that. And the way that the balancing authorities look at this, reliability coordinators, is they looked at these as N-1 and N-2. So they're constantly looking at what-if scenarios to make sure that they're operating their systems reliably, which is their ultimate goal. So when we're looking at KYMEA, what markets do we touch upon? And this is kind of a little busy chart here of the United States, but these are the wholesale electric power markets, and you'll see that Kentucky there, we're in the gray. We touch TVA, we touch MISO, and we touch PJM outside of what's available inside of our LG and EKU balancing authority. So we really only have access to 3 markets, and technically really only 2, being MISO and PJM. So there are limitations. Now you can bring power, from like Southern Company north. Of course, that's just going to entail more transmission to get that to the LG&E TVA interface, which means more dollars. So that's kind of one of the challenges, is where we're located and what we have access to. If we do nothing, so here today, if we do nothing on June the 1st, 2022, when our Vistra PPA comes to an end, this is what our portfolio looks like. So we have 100 megawatts of PPA with Big Rivers. We have a 62 megawatt or 100 megawatt option with Big Rivers as well. We've got 90 megawatts with Paducah. That's a peaking facility. We have 11 megawatts with Paris. Those are diesel peakers. And then we have 32 megawatts of hydro through SEPA. And if you look over to the far right, this is, so we have 333 megawatts of total capacity on the books for June 1st, 2022, but we only have 296 megawatts of firm transmission. And that firm transmission is necessary to bring the power from source to sink. So in the instance of the 100 or the 200 megawatt option in MISO, we have 162 megawatts of firm transmission on MISO, and we also have firm transmission on the LG&E KU system, which is network transmission. And you have to have firm legs on both to maintain that firm path. Let's talk about some contingency. So as we talk about the risks, so when we look back at that last slide, we have 162 megawatts of capacity out of MISO. What happens if that gets curtailed? So, be it some max gen alert in MISO where they curtail exports, or maybe it's tornado damage, storm damage, and it takes out a bunch of interconnection points. You can see here that these are little bar graphs or what our forecast was for June, July, and August of this year, just right around 250 megawatts. So if you got rid of that MISO path, that little white line, you can see that we're well under where we need to be. So that's a huge concern, and something that we must look at as you move forward. You don't want to put, and Heather touched upon this, you don't want to put your eggs all in one basket. So if everything that you have is pointing to MISO, that's a big risk. If something happens to that, to those exports. Another, example here of a contingency is with our Paducah peakers. That's 90 megawatts. Again, the same loads. It's not as bad as MISO, obviously, but still, we would be under where we need to be to meet our demand. Again, it's a huge concern of ours. Imbalance. So now I want to start getting into these. This is part of an ancillary service. We take this service from LG&E KU, and imbalance, it really is just the difference between supply and demand. And the ultimate goal is to make sure that you stay balanced. So if your load's 100 megawatts, ultimately you want your supply to be 100 megawatts. And that little speed dial to the right there, that was a real-time snapshot from yesterday. And ultimately, you want that dial to be at 0. That means you're perfectly balanced. And that's your ultimate goal. ACES, our energy service management partner, they're the guys in the trench, guys and gals in the trenches. They're the ones watching this on a 24-hour basis, constantly shifting schedules and things as weather fronts move in and whatever else happens, curtailments. That's their ultimate goal, is to make sure that speedometer effectively stays at 0. This language under here, this is straight from LG&E KU's open access transmission tariff, which they file with FERC. And one of the things that I want to point out, towards the bottom here, is it's up to the customer to meet its real-time load, and you don't rely on imbalance as a backup, and that's been pointed out to us before with LG&E KU, and it's spelled out here in the tariff. And at the very bottom here, they mention good utility practice, and that's really a catch-all. You'll see this a lot in tariffs, and you'll see it a lot in power purchase agreements, and it really just means that you're not intentionally dragging or pushing. You're doing your best to make that speedometer be at 0. And for imbalances, when we're not within that, we're not at 0, there's penalties and things, so financial implications with LG&E KU. If we're dragging, then they're supplying a service that we're buying generation from them at their system lambda, their dispatch cost at that instant in time. And if we're pushing, then they're buying, at their lease cost for where they're at that current time. And then if you get in or without certain bandwidths, then you get penalized, and it's 7.5% and 25%. So you have to maintain that speedometer within certain thresholds. And as I said before, ACES, they're the ones that are handling this. And really, the challenges with them, given that where we're at inside of LG&E KU and the markets that we do touch, all the power that we get from our PPAs has a tag and a schedule associated with that. Every tag has to be submitted 20 minutes prior to the start. So essentially, you really only get 3 bites at the apple, for within an hour to make a scheduling change. And not only that, but the markets, MISO and PJM, they're subject to ramp capability. And MISO, that's 500 megawatts, and PJM, that's 2,000 megawatts. And it goes on a first come, first served basis. So, and it's in every 15-minute increments that you can get this. So if you need 100 megawatts at the top of the hour and there's no ramp, well, you've got a problem. You may have to try to get it at 15 minutes past the hour. And, effectively for those first 15 minutes, you would be dragging. So, this is just one of those nuances, that we have to deal with. And again, this is ACES. They're the ones in the trenches doing this. To the right here on this slide, you'll see a sample tag. And I know it's kind of busy, but, this is a schedule that would be coming out of MISO to LG&E. And essentially, this just tells everybody that's involved, an energy profile. So what's coming out of MISO, what's going into LG&E, what are the transmission numbers, and everybody in the path has to check off. So in this case, the transmission providers are MISO and LG&E. The control areas are MISO and LG&E. So MISO and LG&E has to check off on this tag for it to get approved. So once, again, they submit this tag 20 minutes prior to start, if LG&E or MISO doesn't accept it, then they've got to, regroup and try to figure something else out. Everything has to line up, sources and sinks, point of receipts, point of deliveries. And, again, it's just one of those nuances. And as we move forward, we obviously have the 54, I'll round it up to 54 megawatts of solar from Ashwood coming online at the end of 2022. And this slide here is an expected output by month. And this is based on data from NREL, which is the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And they have a tool called PV Watts, where you can put in a longitude, latitude, and basically build your facility. So if it's bifocal, if it's tilting, single axis, double axis, and it'll give you what, based on that location, what the perceived output looks like. And that's where this data is from. And you can see, obviously the summer months, the Julys and the August, those are the ones on the top, which is what you would expect. This next slide is data analysis that we did looking at the data. And this is a 2 standard deviation on hour-over-hour changes of potential volatility. As clouds roll in, rain, and then it goes away. These are things, and this is a busy slide, but this is, as we look forward, you can see this is, 20 megawatts, down to 0. Those are big swings. We're limited, if I go back to the imbalance slide, we're limited with that provision of 14 megawatts on either side before we're out of compliance. And you have 90 minutes to correct those deviations, or they start declaring energy emergencies. And if it gets, we've talked about these before, if it gets to a level 3, which is the highest, then they just start curtailing load. They being LG&E KU, they're our balancing authority. They would be getting directives from TVA, who is the reliability coordinator, and they would have to do that to maintain, again, the big word, reliability of the grid. So, if you can't maintain or keep up with your load, they'll take care of it for you, and we'll start, taking some lines out, which nobody wants to happen. When those things do happen, audits occur, NERC will be involved, CERC will be involved, but fines, it's not a good thing when that happens. And knock on wood, it doesn't happen very often, but certainly the potential is there. One of the things, obviously another thing that we got to look at when we plan moving forward is load uncertainty. And the big factors that affect that, obviously, historical load, weather, Mother Nature wins every time. No matter what anybody says, Mother Nature is going to tell you, if it's sunny or if it's not, and that's going to affect your load. Econometrics, which essentially is just a quantitative analysis of economic data, demographics, rate classes. So do you have a bunch of residents, is it mainly residential? Do you have commercial load? Do you have industrial load? Any energy policies, for us to go out, any of our members have energy policies. Demand response, energy efficiency. Is there any energy efficiency programs out there? And then we've got, saturation levels of newer technologies. And what I mean by that is, as people replace incandescent bulbs with LED bulbs, smart appliances, smart thermostats, at what point does that kind of effect start weaning as people have adopted it? That's important. Distributed generation is important. And the bottom one here is, if I would have been standing here a year ago, this wouldn't even be on here. But pandemics, we're living it right now with COVID-19, and we're seeing the effects on load. So, these are all things that go in, and you're trying to do your best to get an accurate forecast of what you think your demand's going to be, because there's fiduciary responsibilities associated with that. And as we turn to this next slide, why is it important? What's the primary step when you're planning, when you're looking forward? This is, again, you're trying to balance supply and demand. So, you try to get yourself into a good point where you're confident on what you think that future demand is going to look like. Obviously, if you overestimate, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a wasted investment. You don't want to spend money that you don't have to. And if you don't, if you underestimate, well, the picture here to the right, that's a blackout. So those are unfortunately the things that, that can happen. Going back here to ancillary services. So these are other services that, as our transmission provider, LG&E KU, provides for us. Ancillary services, again, they're necessary to support transmission capacity and energy from resources to loads. That's why they're there. And again, there you see that word, good utility practice. You'll see that all over. Regulation and frequency response. Again, this goes back to maintaining that frequency at 60 hertz, which goes right back to reliability. They have to maintain the grid, and that's where they, that's our frequency that we have to maintain. That service is $6.90 a kilowatt month, and that's applied to 1% of the network load. We're currently, I'll call it, on a super peak day, maybe 270 megawatts would be our high. The next one here is spinning reserve. So what this means is, what do you have that's online that's not at its maximum? It's sitting there spinning. So if load does go up, can you bring something up to take care of that? Those are reserves. So this deals with load intermittency. That service is $7.13 a kilowatt a month, and that's applied to 1.5% of network load. The next one is operating reserve, supplemental reserve. So this is, what do you have in your portfolio that's not online that can be brought up quickly to deal with load variations? It's the same price as the spinning reserve, and it's applied again to 1.5%. Next thing I want to touch upon here is capacity markets. So we're inside LG&E KU. As I mentioned, there are no capacity markets inside of here, but there are capacity markets inside of PJM, and there are capacity markets in MISO. PJM conducts an annual base residual auction. It's in May. It's a 1-year commitment for 3 years in the future. Their planning year is June through May. It's intended to support their reliability pricing model. But this auction, as of recently, has been on hold as PJM negotiates with stakeholders and FERC surrounding the auction itself, where they're looking at the base residual auction, fixed resource requirements, and minimum offer price rules, MOPR. And all these discussions came about due to market concerns, economics, and subsidies. I'm sure many of you have seen things in the papers of nuclear facilities getting subsidies due to declining capacity prices. Obviously, the subsidies with renewables and demand response. So this is where all this came about. You've got load serving entities, against generating facilities, and so it's been going on for a while. I don't know when it's going to get resolved, but or what the outcome's going to be. But I can tell you that the last BRA, which was for planning year 21-22, the market cleared at $4.26 a kilowatt month, or if you convert that to megawatt day, it's $140 a megawatt day. MISO conducts an auction as well. It's only for the upcoming year. So their planning resource auction, PRA, opens up in March, and it's for the upcoming year that begins in June. And the last PRA for 2021 for Zone 6, which is the zone that the LGE MISO interface is in, cleared at 0.1521 cents per kilowatt month, or $5 a megawatt day. Obviously, rather different than PJM. MISO, Doug shows charts during board meetings that shows that curve, that with supply and demand, and every year they get closer to crossing that point as retirements continue to happen, and there's a big risk that it snaps. Effectively, you could go from $5 to $200 a megawatt day. There is a risk for that. I don't whether or not it happens, I don't know, but that's certainly a risk. The other markets that we can rely upon is bilateral markets, and that's just based upon what counterparties you're enabled with to go out and get offers for. We did get some back, in the RFP process in the bilateral market. We'll kind of talk about those a little bit later. But there's a lot of uncertainty around capacity markets on where people put value at. You can get large bid-ask spreads. You may think it's worth X. Obviously, the buyer thinks it's X minus something, and the seller thinks it's X plus something. So you just got to meet in the middle and come up with an execution price. And I believe that is everything that I have on operational considerations. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Rob. We're going to segue in from what Rob talked about into what we're going to call the lessons of California. As outlined in the operational considerations Rob just went through, we have this awesome responsibility of supplying and transmitting low-cost, stable, and reliable power supply to our member communities and their customers. In preparation for any integrated resource plan, it's really prudent to study other market behavior, past behavior, what's going on in other markets, policies, any successes they've had. Can we mimic what they're doing? And any mistakes they made in their markets. And this brings us to California. I said earlier, California is often kind of referred to as a canary in the coal mine in terms of they're the leading indicator, and time again they've proven maybe as the poster child of what not to do. If we go back 20 years to the summer of 2000, they had blackouts in California, and it had to do with what they called the California energy crisis and a poor market design coupled with market manipulation. So what California did, and in the late 90s, FERC deregulated the market and made it open access. And that's a good thing. Markets are a good thing. California was a first comer to that, and they said, we want to participate in these markets. And they thought it's going to be great for the customer. But they did some pretty radical things very quickly without kind of dipping their toe in the water. One of them was they said, we're going to make all the utilities divest of their assets. So they no longer have generating assets to back up the load. They said further, we're going to cap retail electricity prices so prices can't be raised on the retail side. Well, that all sounds great too, because the promise made by the politicians was we're going to go to the market, things are going to be lower, we're not going to even raise your prices. And that opened a way to who's going to take over these assets and what are the rules around those assets. Well, this is all very new, and quickly energy trading companies such as Enron, which I'm sure everybody's heard of, discovered they can manipulate this California market quite easily, make enormous profits, and they really didn't have the consumer in mind. They weren't thinking about the customer. In fact, there's recorded tapes of them laughing at grandma being without power, those types of things. And it's because of this flawed market design that all this happened. The flawed market design, it wasn't because it was a bad idea to deregulate. Markets are what we're in right now, and it drives prices lower. It's a good thing. It had to do with maybe moving too quickly, and that's kind of one of the lessons we want to learn here. So while Enron conducted this criminal activity, and it was all on them, really the larger problem was this flawed market design and an energy policy with open the doors to their abuse. The traders admitted they could manipulate this California power grid they started to do it in February of 2000. It lasted over a year into the spring of 2001. And there were blackouts that took place in Northern California in that summer of 2000. This is all driven by what they did. They would take units on forced outage, even though they weren't forced out, hold the power back, drive the prices up. They knew that was coming. They'd make money. When they brought the units back on, they'd make money back on the way down, making a lot of money, and end up people went to jail over it. And so that's a lesson about policy mishaps and what happened in California. Now let's fast forward 20 years to this year and look just a month back in August of 2020. California again has made some mistakes over there that maybe perhaps we can learn from. They have very aggressive renewable energy policies coupled with poor planning that again put them in a high market price blackout conditions. And I'm sure people are watching what's happened in California, and they've had rolling blackouts. And imagine if it were not for the pandemic and businesses being shut down, how much worse it even could have been. But at the core this time, it wasn't market manipulation. It had to do with simply a supply and demand problem. They didn't have enough supply to meet demand, the plan for these really heat wave that came through California. And again, remember, that was COVID influenced. So in fact, it would have been a worse problem if the economy was strong like it was just 6 months ago. So it had to do with inadequate planning. So as they transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewables, you need to plan appropriately. And right now they have about 36% of their state's energies tied to renewables. That's put a tremendous strain on the power grid that hasn't been properly addressed. So they're moving full force, 100 miles an hour, moving forward to renewables, but perhaps they haven't planned how we're going to meet those in intermittency type resources. So what can we learn from California's experience? Because even though we're not like California, we're not huge, we're in the middle of the Midwest, in the South, we're far away from their issues. We have similar issues in some regards. That is, KYMEA looks somewhat like an island, just like California does. And we'll kind of talk about more of that this afternoon as well as we plan for renewable energy. So let's go back to summer readiness. If you look at California and what they had to prepare for in terms of summer readiness, they anticipated a low probability that in late summer, what I have in the red box, there could be some outages perhaps. It had to do with if there wasn't enough hydro or if the weather conditions were hot. There's some slight probability. So we do summer readiness for both summer and winter at KYMEA. We present that to the board each time to say, here's our preparation. Here's what we're thinking for the resources we need to get through these extreme, either cold periods of time or hot periods of time. California did the same, and they kind of tipped their hand saying, hey, we think there could be a problem. And they expected it to be in late summer, like August, like it did occur, and it would be during the evening hours. So it wasn't a surprise that this could occur, maybe perhaps a surprise that as hot as it got, and they knew it'd be close. And it's always close because when you have very few resources and a few of those resources trip offline, or the conditions for hydro are low and you're dependent upon that, or you're importing a lot of power, all those things culminate into a problem. And it's a problem you don't want to have. Reliability, cost is important, but as Rob talked about earlier, reliability is number one. There's not a business around that said, hey, I can just take blackouts. This is a third world country when you get into that type of world, and you don't want to do that. You want to make sure you have a reliable, stable power supply, and you do it at a low cost, but it's got to be stable and it's got to be there, and you got to plan for it. You got to plan for it reliably. You got to plan for it for contingencies. Contingencies are not every unit's going to work properly. That's just their machines. The loads are going to come in higher than we expected. That happens. You got to prepare. So when we get to what California did to prepare, they've been looking at this a long time. So it didn't sneak up overnight on California that when we put a lot of resources in terms of renewable resources, in particular solar, there's a phenomenon called, they coined it way back in 2012, called the duck curve. Now the duck curve is, I'm going to try to explain it here. If you look at, and this is a March load shape, and you look at the very top light blue line, that's 2012. 2012, that's the load shape before very much solar was put on the system. So you see kind of a hump in the morning and a hump in the evening, and that's what load shapes look like in the shoulder periods in the winter. As you get to the summer periods, it's generally just kind of a big hump in the middle of the day when the heat comes, generally later in the day as people get home and get ready to cook dinner for the family and so forth. What California knew was coming, because they knew a lot of solar was coming on, was each year that went by, as more solar was added, they have a net effect. So if you took your load shape and you start saying, I'm going to take solar and subtract it from that load, what does that look like? And that solar is going to be very coincident. So any solar you put in, rooftop solar, utility scale solar, it's going to have the same shape because the sun rises and sets in the same fashion. There's cloud cover, but overall it's going to look like we're showing here. And it began to look like a duck. So if you get to the year 2020, and this is a very old graph, but they predicted exactly what's happened, you're going to have a time when you have this belly of the duck on this net load that shows up. So if you follow it from early in the morning, you see the tail of the duck. As you move across, and you'll see when the solar comes up in the morning, it starts to come down to the belly. And then in the evenings, when the sun sets, it goes ramping back up. This was a concern. It used to be that we were very concerned about how are we going to serve load in the middle of the day when these real traditional peaks used to occur. Now we're very concerned about a different time of day due to solar generation. Not a bad thing, but we need to plan accordingly. And California knew about this. They said, we're very early on saying, well, we got a problem when the sun's starting to come up. We're going to have overgeneration. So we have units online that are running, and these units back down to minimum generation, but they can't be shut all the way off. Or if they are shut all the way off, they have thermal stress where perhaps they can't start back up. So the nature of the types of units they had at that point in time were units that can't cycle on and off throughout the day. Nuclear units in particular, you really can't cycle them at all. Coal units were all but banned in California, so they can cycle some, but they have a minimum turn down. So then you're starting to look at what can move up and down very quickly. Now, batteries are said to be the game changer, and we'll talk a little bit about batteries in a few slides, and perhaps they will be game changers in the future, but it certainly wasn't anything to help California in their blackout conditions right now. So the overgeneration is the risk of what do we do with this excess generation. Then you start saying, oh, I got to keep that generation online, the thermal units, so they start curtailing solar. Or they give a price signal that said, your solar is worth negative. In fact, I'm not going to pay you for your solar at all. In fact, you have to pay me to take it. And that happens in these markets. You have negative pricing. So imagine going to a store, pick up something off the shelf, and they said, you can take that off the shelf, and by the way, I'm going to give you $10 to take it. It's the world we live in for excess generation that can't be stored very easily, so what do we do with it? You're giving price signals that actually go negative. The bigger problem comes as we come out of the solar into the evenings. You're seeing a ramp of over 13,000 megawatts in this case. 13,000 megawatts is enormous. That's like 13 nuclear plants. So there's no nuclear plants left in California. They're all gone now. So imagine that kind of ramp up when you have resources to say, well, okay, I'm out of solar. I'm not getting any more in the evening. How much wind do I have? Well, wind's intermittent as well. I have hydroelectric. I'm trying to chase it with that. And I'm really depending on gas resources to make up that ramp. So gas has become a very good fuel for trying to follow it, in particular, units that can react very quickly, ramp up and down. Reciprocating engines are a good example. And that's kind of the world where solar coupled with those types of units seems to work best. To understand better what I'm talking about on this duck curve is, let's just look at, this is a March day again. Let's look at this double hump shape, and this is just the demand of a typical day in California in March. So you'll see in the evening hours, and it drops down in the 2, 3 in the morning, picks up in the morning as people are getting up, ready to go to work, go to school, those types of things. And then we drop down as it warms up in the middle of the day. I don't need as much power. And then you come home in the evening and everybody's back at home again and ramping things up. So there's a double hump that takes place in the March time period and the winter times. In the summer, you see generally just a single hump in that shape. has to do with the weather, of course, is a big driver of why you have that different changes by season. If we net that out, net demand means if I take that demand and I start to subtract away solar, in this particular case, they also took away some wind, so you can see how that dropped down, but we get this shape of the duck again, and that's the duck curve. So I'm going to bring us to where we're at right now with the blackouts. Starting in August 14th of this year, the California ISO knew they were getting in trouble. The loads is very hot out there, very hot peaking conditions, and as it got warmer under those peaking conditions, then they said, well, do we have enough resources? They were looking ahead, said, boy, it's going to be tight. And they started calling for contingencies and alerts along the way. Now, they have something called flex outages, where that way they go to the general public and say, can you start conserving? And that's fine, but there's oftentimes people can't conserve, or they get tired of conserving and say, you know, I paid for this power. It's inconvenient for me to conserve. I don't want to send people home from work, those types of things. And I can't. I really can't conserve because I have a business to run, or I have a restaurant, or I have a movie theater, all those types of things. So that started that chain of events. So that chain of events led us to blackouts that occurred on that Friday and through the weekend. And it's very rare when loads are lower in the weekend. You don't have blackouts on weekends. Usually that's a weekday type event, but they were having troubles. Those troubles spilled over into Monday and Tuesday of the following week, which Tuesday was the 18th of August, and we're going to talk about that. The loads are predicted to be over 50,000 megawatt hours, or excuse me, megawatts, and they're trying to figure out how we're going to serve that. The chart that I'm showing right here shows a deficiency of about 4,500 megawatts. So they're saying, we just don't have it, and we can't import it. There's nowhere to get this power. The imports are getting tight because the surrounding regions say, I don't have anything to sell to you. We're trying to keep our own lights on. And that's where the blackouts really start to occur, saying we just can't do it. We have to roll the blackouts. Otherwise, as Rob talked about before, the system becomes unstable. So if you don't roll the blackouts, you said, we're just going to let it go and start to drop. The voltage drops, the frequency drops, and if you don't drop the load on your own, it's going to start dropping automatically. There's frequency response that said we need to start shedding load, or this whole thing's going to fall apart. And if the whole thing falls apart, and it's happened over the last 3 decades, we'll see every now and then an example of a cascading effect where a problem starts in Ohio and goes all the way to New York City within an hour. And next thing you know, you got a big area out of power and trying to bring the whole system back over the course of days or perhaps weeks. So this is what they're trying to manage the grid, the very type of thing that we're concerned about as an agency to make sure we have enough adequate resources and contingencies to serve our members. So let's look at the blackouts. The blackouts were continuing, I said. We're on Tuesday, August the 18th. This is the loading of the resources. So they'll see that they do have a band, not all their nuclear is gone. They have a small band of nuclear yet. A little bit of coal. You can't even see it show up, but there's a little bit left on the system. I think it's less than 10 megawatts, in fact. The big blue area, a light blue area, is natural gas. So natural gas loads up. You'll see how it was dispatched. And then large hydro on top of that. The imports is the gray area. So imports were getting curtailed. They sometimes depend on imports as much as 25%. You'll see that's not nearly 25%. And then the green area has to do with renewables. So we got the sun shining, and then it starts to drop in the evenings. And you'll see that little blip in the load shape. That's where blackouts start to occur. But this is how the shape of how things stacked up. So we get the evening hours, we still have some wind, but the solar's gone, of course. If we layer on top of that what happened with market prices, early on throughout the first part of the day, we're under $100 a megawatt hour. And so that's, we're just chugging along at $100 megawatt hour, not super high prices. And then prices explode as we get into those evening hours. So we're sitting at $1,000 a megawatt hour, $1,600 a megawatt hour, and prices got very high. Now they have caps out there to keep it from going super high. In the Texas region, for example, those prices can get as high as $9,000. Back when the markets were manipulated back in 2000, 2 decades ago, prices got as high as $25,000. That will break an agency, break a company very quickly. In this particular case, up in Oregon, Portland General, who used to be an Enron company, in fact, but they went back to a traditional utility. They made some bets. A couple of their traders just was announced last week. They made some bets on this market, and they've wiped out a quarter of their income for that agency. So those traders were betting against. They said, we think there's going to be low prices. We don't think there's going to be volatility. And they made some really bad assumptions, bad bets, contrary to what their company wanted them to do. So there's always a lesson to be learned about understanding reliability, understanding how you properly hedge your market exposure. Batteries are often seen as this panacea. This is going to solve the problem. And I didn't realize it, but there's only 200 megawatts of batteries currently utility scale in California. The way it's announced, you think it was a bigger number than that, but it's not. This is a mere, that's not even 1%, it's 0.4% of their peak load. So out of 50,000 megawatts peak, they have 200 megawatts of batteries. But I want to show an example of, and it used to be the kind of conventional wisdom was, and it generally probably works this way, batteries charged during the low price hours and off peak and discharged during the off peak when it's needed and so forth. The negative numbers in blue bars show the batteries charging. The prices, the spikes that go above zero shows the batteries discharging or being fed to the grid. So you see it bounds between plus or minus 200. So early morning hours, as expected, they're charging up the batteries. They had them discharged from the day before. They get to that spike you'll see in the middle of the day. Said, hey, we better call on some of that battery power. So they discharge a bit up to 50 megawatts. Then they start charging back up again. And they get to that evening hour, that time they knew was going to be a problem on the duck curve, and they discharge for 4 hours. And now they're done. So over those 4 hours, they were doing about 50 megawatts an hour, and you'll see that they're totally discharged. Everything's spent. So then they go out there and they charge back up. And they're charging back up when market prices are $1,600. So they're discharging at a price that's lower, charging back up when it's more expensive, just trying to get through this blackout period. So they charge back up, they discharge again for 1 hour, and now they're done again. This is all they got. So now they're charging everything back up at the highest possible price, trying to get it power so they can get to that next hour. And there's a cycle there that is nonsensical, of course, but that's kind of the performance of the batteries. And it was a little surprising to me. What's led to on this crisis is there's been perhaps as many as 2,000 more megawatts of battery that's expected to be on, I think, by next year or very soon. So everybody's stepping up and saying, we got a problem out here. We need more batteries. But remember back on that duck curve I showed, it's the ramp ups as much as 13,000 megawatts to get from that bottom of the duck curve up to the top within 3 hours. So there's not enough batteries if you add a couple of thousand to do that. You can rely on market imports, but as everybody keeps moving towards renewables, more and more renewables, less and more retirements of dispatchable resources, it's a problem they got to keep planning for. And I know that everybody's looking at it really hard out there. I sympathize. It's very difficult when you have blackouts. There's people that rely on electricity for not just cooling, but they might have medical conditions or all kinds of other things, have a business to run where you can't just have unreliable power. The measures they took to mitigate was something called flex warnings. So first of all, they're collaborating with the other entities, and that's something we all do. Rob talked a lot about that. There's NERC, and for our case, there's NERC and CERC and other balancing authorities when we try to lean on each other. But often you're on your own. In California, they were on their own. Everybody else said, we'll have discussions with you, and we'll do what we can to help you, but we got to take care of ourselves as well. So they said, we don't have any more to sell to you. They issued flex warnings, flex alerts and warnings. These flex alerts are, please start do curtailments. They could be, customers might be paid for those. I don't know enough about if they pay you or just you plead for voluntary curtailments. And I was around 20 years ago in the Midwest when we had a lot of price spikes as well. And when you make pleas for voluntary curtailments, the public does understand and they'll react because they're concerned as well. But if you routinely do it, then it becomes a problem because they said, now it's on you. And we see what's going on in California right now. You'll see a lot of finger pointing. And this wasn't meant to point renewables being the problem. This had to do with renewables going too quickly and not being planned for properly to get through these time periods. And that's the lesson. They called on demand response, emergency energy, so they're trying to clip loads that way. They executed any mechanism they had for excess capacity. They suspended convergent bidding, and this is what got those traders at Portland General in trouble. So this bidding and hedging activities, they got stuck holding the bag on that. And they said, we're going to put you on blackout. If you don't do this on your own, we're going to have to start rolling blackouts, and that's what they had to do. So what's the lessons of California? Well, you need to maintain an adequate reserve margin, clearly. You need to have enough reserves in place. They lost a 475 megawatt unit. It's like, man, for a 50,000 megawatt system, that's a pretty small unit to all of a sudden get you teetering on the brink of blackouts and where you went there. And you also need to plan for, as Rob talked about, N1, N-1, N-2 contingencies. You start losing big units. You start have increased load because of weather. What are we going to do? Do we have enough to account for that? And often when you have excess reserves and people look at your portfolio and say, geez, what'd you buy all that for? You didn't use it. That's like saying, what'd you have all your life insurance for? Because you didn't die. That's not the purpose of that. The purpose is to have enough plan in place so you don't have blackouts, so you adequately reliably serve your customers. You want to diversify your portfolio so you're not dependent on any one technology or fuel source. So if you go too much in one direction, you can get stuck. And that has to do with both renewables and thermal resources. Thermal resources could be either gas curtailments. If you had all gas in a portfolio, you might be stuck that way because of gas curtailments. There's something that does that. And often we look and said, that could never happen. Well, I think if anybody looked at what happened with COVID-19, you say, boy, things can happen. Who would have predicted? And these things, the unpredictable do happen, and you want to be prepared for that. You also want to strike a balance, as Rob showed earlier, between internal resources and imported power. If California would like to brag saying, hey, look at all our balances, all renewables, but they're dependent on imported power that's not renewables. They're saying, well, I'm just going to lean on those guys. Well, you can't do that. You have to plan properly within your own system. So the lessons of California, even though they're half the United States away from us, are something we need to understand as we plan our own power supply and something we look at when we do an integrated resource plan. And it's not just California, it's PJM, it's MISO, what's going on in Texas, the ERCOT market. We just want to understand and learn so we can learn from any successes. There's good stories out there, ways to drive prices lower, and any things that happen that you would say we certainly want to plan accordingly and not let that happen to us. Okay, let's talk a little bit about now our decision time frame. So as you see, we're building up. We're trying to talk about, as Heather talked about, what types of PPAs, investments versus long-term investments. So that's important to consider. We talk about low-cost portfolio, adequate reliability, contingencies, those types of things. Now it gets us into, now when do we need to make decisions with those things in mind? So where we're at in the agenda, decision time frame, we're looking at the 2022-2027 time period. So this is a graph of our capacity, supply, and demand. And inside there it includes a path out to the market. We're going to focus on 3 different areas that are shown in gold. We have an action time period of 2022. You'll notice we're short of our planning reserves in that time period, but also that area in the purple, that is an unhedged area of our portfolio. So we have a transmission path to the market, but we don't have it hedged. Now there's all kinds of ways to do hedging. That hedging could be done with physical assets, it could be done with market products, it could be done with the PPA contracts, and that's the type of things we'll talk about in a bit. So that's one area that we said, okay, what do we do in 2022? We're in 2020, so this is the right timing to look at that. But we're looking ahead for an integrated resource plan. What's our next decision point is 2027. That's when we lose some transmission access, and we would want to decide, do we get more transmission access, roll those rights over and increase them, or do we do something different in 2027? In 2029, we have contracts that drop off, and in fact, all we have left is our commitments is SEPA Hydro and Ashwood Solar. So hydro and solar is the only thing left by 2029. So it's kind of a blank slate like that. So we're focused on those different time periods for our bigger decisions. Short term, we call long term, or medium term, long term, around there. So what's changing in 2022, 2023? Our Vistra, which is Dynegy contract, is the Joppa plant. That was a 3-year PPA. It's backed by coal. It expires in May 31st of 2022. So that was always the plan. There was always the plan to say we're going to layer in contracts. Some expire. What are we going to replace it with? And it was very carefully laid out plan to get the agency stood up and off the ground, moving away from our previous supplier. We're on our 2nd year of operation. We're saving substantial money for the members. We have a very solid, reliable plan in place. So it was well thought out to be conservative to start, to make sure everything's reliable. And then as we move forward, we'll start to change up the mix. One of the big changes we made was, well, I think by 2022, we can take on some more intermittent resources. Rob laid out very clearly, and I backed that up with what's going on in California, the idea that intermittent resources, they can be low cost, they're great for the environment, but sun shines only during a certain part of the day. In the wintertime, it's generally non-existent compared to the summer or in the spring area. And you worry about what happens during the tail end of the time period. So this gives us time, now that the agency's going, we're trying to understand the operations. We have a 24-hour desk that we're working with. Now, how do we match that intermittency to make sure we don't have curtailments and we have a reliable supply? So that's a change that takes place in 2022. Also, Benham and Berea, they're exploring joining the All Requirements Group. Their contracts, so they're part of the planning process. No surprise, and we've mentioned their names as well. They said, they want to look at their options. They're buying from a wholesale. They're members of the agency, but they're buying from a different supplier right now. But they want to look at the next thing that they're going to do, and maybe be part of what's going on with a bigger group. And there are about 38 megawatts of winter peaking load. Their summer peak combines in the neighborhood of 25 to 27, 28 megawatts. Some of the decisions we have to make, we have Paducah peaking capacity right now, 90 megawatts. There was a point in the contract, the contractor were built to be flexible, to said, perhaps we don't need all that. We want to reduce that down and take on a different type of resource, and we can do that in 2023. So that's a decision point that needs to be made by the end of this year that takes place in 2023. MISO point-to-point transmission. Rob talked about this earlier. There's 2 paths for us to get to the market. One of them is we need to have a drive-out rate and drive-out path out of MISO, and then another path to get into our system where our members' loads are in the LG&E KU system, also known as LKE. So we have to have that type of path, or we have internal resources we could build and not have this transmission path. That's another decision to make. Plus that purple area I talked about, how are we going to fill that? How do we hedge that? So if we look at our transitioning energy mix, if we start off on the left, the agency started off by design very conservative. They said, we want to have a portfolio. We're moving away from our supplier. We are saving, our plan was to save, and we're doing it, 14%. So we're at 14% savings, and a lot of that goes into a rate stabilization fund. So it's a fully hedged portfolio. So you save money, fully hedged. The idea was, let's start with low cost energy, maybe a higher demand charge, look at that type of mix, but let's get some very flexible contracts. And these are known as heat rate call options, meaning we have the ability to call on our units at a set upon heat rate, a conversion factor from fuel to power that says, I'm going to take this fuel source, convert it to a power price. However, these are options. So if the market prices for power are lower, we'll say, I'm not going to exercise that option at this hour. I'm going to go buy from the market. Been very advantageous. The markets have been low recently, in particular due to COVID. That gave us a lot of flexibility to buy below the market, but we still had this ability to strike at this heat rate call option if prices got too high. Very comforting for the first 3 years of the agency's operation. We're in year number 2. By design, the agencies said, okay, we're going to move over starting in 2023 or late 2022 to solar. So we got 54 megawatts of Ashwood solar, and we're going to talk more about Ashwood this afternoon. Coupled with our hydro, that's about 13% of our portfolio. And Rob showed the volatility of trying to chase that solar around is something we need to get good at. And we're going to have to get good at it and practice it well before it comes online in a couple of years. Our coal piece has dropped down, so you'll notice it went down to 30% now. And we have what's called, we would call a partially hedged portfolio right now, that gray area. So before, even though we could always, we're buying a lot from the market, we were always hedged where our exposure to the market wasn't that great because if prices started to creep up, we could call on these heat rate call options. We lose one of those heat rate call options in 2022, so now we have market exposure. Not necessarily a bad thing. You can leave a certain percent to the spot market and hedge it through standardized products such as on-peak and off-peak products you buy every month. They don't nicely match a load shape. They're blocky, so you're buying 16 hours at a time for a full week, and it's all the same block size. And that's how the market trades, and you kind of figure out a way to use those products to hedge your uncertainty. So we would call that partially hedged. We're going to have higher energy prices as we move into that and lower demand charges. So now there's a switch in our portfolio to say we're going to drop the price we pay to the fixed component, maybe a little higher price on the variable component, and overall see our cents per kilowatt hour is going to change accordingly. It should be changed for hopefully the better as we get a little more aggressive with some of our strategies. The intermittent solar, though, is non-dispatchable, so we need to account for that. And we need to account for some of the flexibility or lack thereof that we don't have because we don't have as many heat rate call options. So that's the transition we're making. And each time we go through this 20-year plan or 50 years or the life of the agency, there's always going to be transitions. There's always going to be new technologies, changes in load shapes, changes in customer preference, changes in all kinds of things, market policies, for instance, and those are the things we account for. This gets back to our capacity and energy needs. There's a way to look at this very simply in one graph called a load duration curve. So if we took all of our hourly loads, so we peak sometime in July or August, this year it was July, if you take those and sort those from high to low, it gives a shape that we're looking at right now. And that was very traditional. People would do a load duration curve and start stacking their resources, and it gave a nice visual. What's different about it now is you look at an intermittent resource like solar, you can't stack that underneath there because of the time of day that it hits and the season that it hits. So you change, this is the net shape we talked about earlier in the California deck curve. You take your load duration curve and then you reduce it down for each hour of Ashwood solar in this case. So Ashwood's about 9% of our load. It reduces that down, and we start loading in resources. So we still have base load about 62% that's backed by coal or by the market. So if we can buy cheaper than our coal, we'll go buy it from the market, but it's backed up with a very low-cost resource. Gives us a lot of comfort to 2027 of having a good, stable base. Good, reliable, stable, low-cost base. If we look at the top of the curve, we got the Paducah peakers. Very small percent of our needs, but very important to be able to serve load. So you don't run peaking capacity by design very often. It's got a higher heat rate, but it's a lower reservation charge, higher energy cost. Our SEPA hydro from the Cumberland River system down in TVA, we bring that in. We have access rights to that through our members, and we're able to schedule that, and we try to schedule that to hit our peak periods. So we have the top end of the curve covered, and we have the bottom end of the curve covered. the intermediate, and this is the purple graph I showed earlier in the blocks, this is intermediate capacity and energy needs. That's about 24% of our needs in that middle area. This is something that's dispatchable, so it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 60 megawatts, and it's going to run at somewhere between 30 and 50% capacity factor. So you want that to dispatch, and that's about a quarter of our needs. And that's the hole in our portfolio that we're considering that we need to fill for 2022. So that gave us our idea of desired products and an indicative RFP. We're looking for intermittent resources, 30 to 60 megawatts. We'd like it to be dispatchable. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but that kind of fits that area a little bit, and I'll show you why. You'll see how that curve slopes down. It's not a perfect square, but it tails off. Dispatchability allows us to not take a whole block, but take portions thereof. Expected capacity factor, as I mentioned, between 30 and 50%. We could take it in the LG&E system or in the MISO system because we have that path to MISO that I talked about earlier. We also, in this RFP, we're interested in some solar, what that looks like for pricing. Again, LG&E or the MISO system, maybe that fits in that area that we talked about. And then solar plus storage. We want to understand batteries better. As I mentioned, California's only got 200, and they're kind of the leading edge on this. So we're trying to understand batteries, but we certainly want to watch the experience of others and learn more about it. One of the things as we explore batteries so far, has been a little surprising to us was the lack of ability to cycle batteries. So the provider might tell you that you get, out of 8,760 hours in a year, you can only cycle those batteries 100 times in the year. Well, that's not very many cycles up and down. And you'll notice that graph I showed earlier in California, they were cycling the heck out of it. It was going from negative to positive numerous times within that one day. So the cycling's an issue. So we're trying to chase our existing solar intermittency and trying to balance our load. And so that's another thing that we're considering as part of this indicative RFP. And with that, I'll have Rob come up and talk about the RFP now.
Thank you. All right, I'll get started here on the RFP. So this was RFP number 2020-1. Flip this slide here. So this was released on July the 24th of 2020, and as Doug had mentioned, it was for intermediate capacity and energy resources. Commencement of services to begin on June the 1st of 2022, when the Vistra PPA comes to a close, and for terms of 3 to 20 years. We sent the RFP directly to 63 interested parties and 7 publications. Any questions that the proposers had, surrounding the RFP, those were due on August the 12th, 2020, and the proposals themselves were due on August the 19th. In total, we received 29 different proposals. The volume ranges were from 30 megawatts to 250. Now that wasn't specific to just KYMEA. That would have been a slice of a larger project. I can tell you that we received proposals in the LG&E KU footprint. We received some in MISO Zone 6, and we also received some in MISO Zone 4, which is the Illinois region of MISO. As far as the types of products that we got back, we did get some firm LD energy blocks. Firm LD, is liquidated damages. That falls under a resource in LG&E KU's tariff. And what an energy block is, Doug had mentioned before. I mean, it is. It's just a block. If you look at the little chart on the right, you'll see this is just a typical energy area day for KYMEA, which is the blue. That little orange line is a 50 megawatt on-peak block only, so it reduces that blue line by 50 megawatts across the peak. A little tough chart to visualize, but that's in essence what it's doing. We also received some zonal resource credits inside of MISO in Zone 6, and those were tied directly with some of the firm LD energy blocks. We also received some daily gas indexed heat rates, and for those that don't know, a heat rate is strictly a measurement of efficiency. So in this case, just for simple math, let's just say the heat rate was 10 and the daily index gas price was $3. Then for that day, you'd get energy at $30. So you just take the gas price times the heat rate, and that gives you your dollar per megawatt hour cost. Some of the other responses that we did get, of course, were energy and capacity. We got some standalone solar projects. So again, some were inside LG and EKU, some were inside of MISO. We did get some solar plus storage, and we also got some standalone storage, and we've got some responses for gas generation, and also market purchases. So all in all, it was, given the timing, I was happy with the responses that we got. Of course, any path that we go down, assuming, let's just say it's more solar, then, I would guess that we would submit or release another RFP specific to that technology alone, instead of a wide, cast of the net, which this initial RFP included basically everything. So this next slide here, so this is information on the RFP itself. So this is on the website. If you go over to the second last drop-down menu on the right, the information, it's underneath that. So you can see the actual RFP itself, and there's some questions, Q&A, and the bid documents. So anybody that's interested in seeing information on that, that's where you can find that on the website. And that's all I have to say about the RFP itself. I think we're going to go into now talking about the scoring matrix and how we're going to do that. And none of this is set in stone yet on any of the weightings and things of that nature, but this is the mechanism that we'll present to the board as far as a staff recommendation. So obviously, when we look at these proposals, these are the things that are really important. And Heather mentioned this earlier, right out of the gate, credit. So what's your counterparty exposure? So if you sign a 20-year PPA for solar with counterparty Y, are they going to be able to, are they going to be able to get it online in time, as based on the PPA itself? Are they going to be there in 10 years? Those are all kinds of risks that you gotta weigh. The term. So what's the length of the proposal? Obviously, solar proposals are 20 years. If you're getting into any sort of generation, it's going to be 20 plus years. But any market deals, we've got responses for 5 years. We've got responses for 10 years. How do these responses flange up with existing, the existing transmission portfolio? Do you go beyond those? Do you roll those over? Because once you roll those over, and that's a financial obligation, moving forward. So you got to really think about that as well. And as far as the transmission is concerned, I'm going to talk about this down below on the location. You got to worry about, can the transmission provider provide it in time? So that's another concern. Flexibility. So does the proposal allow for future growth into, not only new technologies, but as existing technologies, get better at efficiencies, performance, and pricing, particularly like batteries. When you look at pricing curves that we've seen for battery storage, it's coming down. It's, later in this, decade, but, you want to leave some room for growth. And who knows, 10 years from now, who knows what's going to come about. So you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. Not only for that, but also for just the diversity. And again, I'm going to talk about that here again as far as sensitivities with whatever technologies you do get into. Location. So deliverability risk. Can I get the power from the resource to the load? Obviously, the further you move away electrically, the greater the risk of that not happening happens. And that segues right into congestion risks. So again, the further that source is from the ultimate sink, the greater that congestion risk. There's, we mentioned that, that negative pricing, you can get into projects that, a great deal of the time, the prices aren't, they're well under where you're taking power from. So you gotta model that as well. And, you gotta have a forward-looking view too, as far as what else is on the horizon that's going to be built that may even, exacerbate that congestion risk. But that's a big thing. Transmission cost. So, recently, year-over-year transmission cost increases have been, on the magnitude of 10%. If you extrapolate that out the curve, transmission becomes extremely pricey. So, leaning on the markets and things, that has to be put into those decision trees as far as what do you think transmission is going to cost you? Because we can certainly have a lot of transmission in the portfolio, but that may not make the most sense. Performance and reliability. Again, I talked about this earlier. The golden rule really is reliability. Maintaining supply and demand. So if you're going to get into a project, you want to make sure that it's going to deliver. And depending on the technologies, you're going to get different performance guarantees. But you want to make sure that, hey, when I call on this, I'm pretty certain that I'm going to get what I paid for. Obviously, price is certainly important. It's not the only driver, but it's certainly weighs pretty heavy on any decisions moving forward. And Heather touched upon this earlier in the IRP process, but as far as the sensitivity scenario analysis, so when you look at all these responses, how are they going to react to different scenarios? So you have a base case, which is what you think the world's going to look like. What happens if gas goes up 50%? What happens if gas comes down? What if your demands are higher than what you think? What if they're lower? Carbon limits with high gas, carbon limits with low gas. What if there's a national carbon tax? And what if you got zero carbon additions, meaning everything that your portfolio has to have a zero carbon footprint? And those are all things that you got to weigh into your decision making. Again, it's a financial obligation. Any way you go, there's a hole that we got to fill. So you can't stand back and not do anything. You got to do your due diligence and plan accordingly. This last slide, and again, this is not set in stone. So it's basically a scorecard, a matrix, so to speak. So each criteria will have a certain weight. You grade each proposal, and then you come up with a score on the right, and effectively that's how it shakes out on what we perceive to be the best option. That may not be the path that we choose, but you got to have some way to check the boxes to make sure that you evaluate everything correctly. But that's all I have on the RFP.
Okay, thanks, Rob. So we were right on schedule and where we wanted to be now. The last thing we want to talk about then is an opportunity for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, you want to type them into the chat box with Heather, and I think they're going to click on that and they show up there, and maybe Heather's got some already, and we'll be happy to answer them. If we don't answer them now, we'll get an answer back to you either today or if it takes us longer to research it after that. There will be another opportunity this afternoon to also have chat box questions as well.
Yes, Doug, we do have a few questions. Did you receive any solar responses to the RFP? And if so, was the pricing below the point indicated from previous meetings to forego an additional 30 megawatt from the Ashwood development?
So we're under non-disclosure on a lot of those things, but the Ashwood incremental piece on the Ashwood project is the most competitive.
Will you model the feasibility of multiple distributed solar resources tied to your larger member distribution system, sized so as not to backfeed, and taking into account the avoided multiple transmission fees and system loss costs?
So sounds like that means behind the meter solar installations. Okay. So for those of the on the phone that don't or on the call that don't quite understand it, you can put generation behind the meter, it's called. And so we're on the wholesale, the power grid side, so the transmission side. So we have resources or imports, and we'll show some graphs on this later this afternoon of where our supply is. If you put behind the meter generation, and I believe the question asked about avoiding transmission charges, actually the tariff wouldn't allow us to do that. So even if you have behind the meter generation, you don't avoid the transmission charges. But often you would say, well, maybe there's still some benefits of putting behind the meter generation. It's local and so forth. The trade-off, if we looked at renewables, the trade-off between small installations of solar, let's say several megawatts that could fit inside a town, versus a large facility like Ashwood, and we're going to look at Ashwood really hard this afternoon, that covers over a square mile, is pricing-wise is really night and day difference. And so if we were to look at behind the meter generation, it would be a trade-off of trying to put generation locally at a higher cost or doing a utility economies of scale generation like we're doing now. It's something if the membership's interested because they want to have some visibility behind the meter, that's certainly open, but there is a cost trade-off that takes place with that is really not to the overall benefits of pricing.
Regarding Rob's Ashwood solar output volatility slide, did we model the Ashwood solar output with load to determine net load volatility?
So we use a model called Encompass, and Encompass is an hourly production cost model that optimizes the portfolio. So it uses a mixed integer programming that runs every hour. As part of that, we put all of our members' loads in. We put all of our resources in. The resources that we're talking about, like Ashwood, has a pattern that goes with it. So there's an hourly pattern of solar output. Our members' loads are put in individually by member, then they're aggregated together as well. So those two do net together and take place inside the model.
Fabulous. Regarding the California duck curve slides, do you plan to model solar with Kentucky irradiance on KYMEA load to get more representative data?
Absolutely. Yeah, what we're using right now is very close to our site. And in October, we're going to get a year's worth of data from our vendor, RWE, who's building the site. But until then, as Rob talked about, we use a company called NRail off of their site. PV Watts is their product. PV Watts means you put in the longitude and latitude of where our site's at, and when we put that longitude and latitude in, we're able to see and the size, the type of units. So we have a single axis which follows the sun, the tilt that we have, what kind of ground cover we have. You put all those things in, and it gives us an hourly pattern. So we're using a Kentucky site very, very similar to what we're going to have. And we'll get better data as we have meters out there to measure the irradiance at this point in time.
Has KYMEA created any new load forecast, and will it be shared in this meeting?
We do a new load forecast, as Rob talked about earlier, Mod 32. So we do that every year for a 10-year forecast. So we have one we just submitted Monday, I believe. Yes. So it's been submitted Monday. It will not be shared at this meeting per se. We don't have a load forecast projection and a graph or anything, but that is available. What I can just tell you, our load forecast, it's minimal. We think load forecast is somewhere around 0.5% a year. It's been dropping somewhat each year. It's been very difficult. We had pretty good peaking conditions this year, but with the impact of COVID, we think we maybe lost early on 15% of our load, and it started to come back. So we're trying to get our arms around the load forecast that's true, that'll come back when the COVID, hopefully soon, the COVID crisis is over. But that's something we're constantly weighing.
Okay. Can you explain the BREC option, and is it still applicable?
So the BREC option is we have a transmission path for our 100 megawatt Wilson contract. So Wilson's a coal plant. Okay, so let's put that one aside. There's another option we have that we need to buy. We have a path to MISO. You need to have an identified source inside MISO for that path. And so we have an agreement with BREC to use them as the source solely for the purpose of that's the location or where the option's at. So we're buying market price energy. It's nothing off the BREC system. It's not off any of their units, but they are the source, the identified source in MISO that flows into the LG&E system. We call it the BREC option. We could call it the MISO option in some sense, but BREC is our counterparty because we needed an identified location and counterparty to make that power flow.
Will any of the RFP responses result in the award of a contract, or will there be another RFP issued in 2021?
We need to make a decision very soon by the end of this year for certain things. And that is, we're going to have to reserve transmission. There's transmission studies that take place. If we're going to build a resource or enter into a contract, some of those things have to be done now as well, because in our world, we're less than 2 years away from the summer of 2022, and that's 2 years is upon us before you know it. So there could be another RFP that fine-tunes the board's direction, but overall, we expect to perhaps act on either this IRP or RFP or make some decisions around it for that short-term period. So there likely could be another RFP, but it won't be in 21. It'll be something that it stems from a further detailing of the RFP responses we got thus far.
Great. Does energy efficiency demand side management fit into the current IRP?
So energy efficiency, demand side management, they certainly fit in the IRPs. People certainly need to keep in mind we are a wholesale provider as opposed to an vertically integrated company like LG&E, KU. So we don't have customers. We have members that buy all of their power supply from us. So if the members are interested in a energy efficiency program for the benefit of all the membership, that's a direction to go, and that's a direction we could go and implement those types of programs. Otherwise, individual members have been putting in, one of our larger members has put in their own energy efficiency program and started that, and that's up to them as well. So the whole point of what we do is a collaborative effort. If the membership decides they want to go a certain direction, we can put that together. Energy efficiency has been an odd one somewhat recently, and that is it happened organically as we moved into these new technologies. In 2007, President Bush at that time signed into law, said we're going to have only LED lights moving into the future. So as you move into only LED lights, which use about 1/10 of what an incandescent bulb did, that's been a great move. It's here we are, down the road, and I think a lot of people, myself, I have all LEDs in my home, except one bulb I can't get out of the socket for whatever reason, but it's stuck in there. But other than that, I have all LEDs, and it's you don't have the heat that comes off of them. It saves on the power bill, and it's a good thing. For us to subsidize that through the agency is probably not good money spent because we are not for profit. All the money that we spend on programs comes from our membership. So it's anything they put into there is something the members end up paying for. Other programs that you look at, you say, well, as technology changes, some of these things are better and maybe better done by the customer themselves. Setback thermostats were something people were interested in, but now there's better technologies out there that people probably put in on their own. Google and others have kind of jumped into that, and customers just do it. So we look a lot of organically of what's going on in energy efficiency and decide, is it money well spent, or is the consumer confident they can do that on their own? Because sometimes consumers drive what they want to do to save money on their own, that we don't need to have all the customers or all the members subsidize the few that want to do that.
Very good. Envision Franklin County would like to commit the KYMEA to achieving 100% carbon-free renewable energy in your power supply by no later than 2030 and reject any new investments in coal or natural gas resources. Would you consider this?
We've run that scenario, and we'll show that this afternoon. Anything's open for the board's consideration. I will tell you, just give a preview, it's a very expensive proposition, and Rob talked about very risky. We're sitting in an area, much like California, where if we relied totally on intermittent resources, we would be subject to some of the more problems than they have, in fact. And that's a very aggressive goal 100% by 2030. No one's even really considering that for the most part. You'll see individual companies like Amazon say we're going to be 100% by a certain date. They're relying on a grid. They're inside MISO, they're inside PJM, where they can say I can have a net zero carbon, but I'm going to be buying from fossil fuels throughout the course of the day, and I can balance it out at the end of the year. In our case, our balancing act is we are supplying to all of our members, and for us to make a commitment like that is very risky and probably not a very smart plan. Sometime in the future, maybe 2050, who knows how technologies unfold, things could change, but we're keeping an eye on a balanced portfolio, and we'll talk about that more this afternoon.
Fabulous. It looks as if it might be a good time to join MISO for transmission advantages. Is that being considered?
It's always on a consideration to join an RTO. Very expensive, because now you're building transmission lines that cost a lot, and they're harder to place than a generating unit, in fact, to an RTO. And it might be 30 miles for one member, it might be 50 for another, it might be 10 for yet another. To hook all those in and join an RTO, then you would say, well, be careful what you wish for. It's nice to be in a market, but now there's market rules you have to abide by. Rob talked about earlier at PJM, the capacity prices in PJM are high. Some of our members would need to go that direction. In MISO, they're heading down a path of maybe no return if they don't start building more capacity. The curve keeps shrinking. We watch that every year. And there's a lot of pressure from somebody called the market monitor that looks at that market to say, you need to start building a capacity market. So we could go join an RTO thinking there's MISO, for instance, that there's all kinds of advantages. And perhaps you'll say, boy, you spent a lot of money to join someone when we could have just built generation internal to our system. It's never off the table. It's an important thing to consider, and it'll be carefully considered. But right now, it's just on the table.
Great. Within IRP, are you evaluating efficiency demand side management programs as a resource for reducing load and the need to lower power supply requirements? In other words, are you treating DSM as a resource?
So right now, as I talked about before, we don't have any programs set up in the model. If the members identify those types of programs or are interested in them for the greater good of all the membership, we'll do it. If an individual member goes down that path, we will model the program that they put in place.
As a follow-up to the RFP question, from your response, it seems there is an intent to contract with one or more of the RFP respondents prior to the acceptance of the IRP by the board. If this is not the case, when do you expect contracts to be executed as a result of the RFP?
So we won't enter into any contracts without the approval of the board. That's the board's decision. So the acceptance of the IRP and the acceptance of these contracts go hand in glove, really. What we would do is if the board said, our action plan, short-term action plan is to go down this direction, that's what they approved, that will be included in the IRP. Then remember, IRPs are 20 years. Then we're looking out, what does that affect 8 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out? And we'll put all that together as part of the report. Then the board, of course, will accept that report. But this was approvals that are embedded within that report along the way. There won't be a report at the very end where we just throw it down and say, approve everything here, because the timing is such that just makes it impossible to do.
Right. Germany has achieved 100% renewable energy on some days. Has this model been studied?
I have not studied the Germany model. I am aware of what they're doing over there. They've had fits and starts and high prices and high renewables. And I know they probably lean on the grid a bit as well. Europe's an interconnected grid somewhat as well. I used to model that back in my consulting days, so I know a little bit about it. But I haven't spent a lot of time on it recently. I know there's examples of heavy renewables in certain areas, and that's one of them.
Will load forecasts used within the IRP be made public?
The load forecast?
Yes.
Yes, they will be part of the IRP report, including any uncertainty that goes around it. If you look at load uncertainty, we don't have perfect knowledge of what the load's going to be. And in fact, like I mentioned earlier, we're trying to get our arms around it, just given the impact of COVID. And we know it feels like we've lost load, but we haven't had really load peaking conditions. We haven't seen 100-degree weather for any sustained period of time. We saw a lot of hot weather this last July, and that would have gave us a better indication of where the load is. But there's businesses shut down, so we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what we're missing. And so we're being very careful about, because you get only certain chances to have enough resources and transmission available. And if you underestimate that, we have nowhere else to go. I hope Rob drove that point home, because I want to say it again. We're an island with responsibilities to get our load, get our act in order each hour. And if all of a sudden we say, oh, we didn't have enough this hour, they're going to say, well, then we're being called to the carpet. NERC and CERC get involved. Balancing authorities get involved. They said, what are you doing? You're not planning properly. And that's not a path we're going to go down.
Regarding batteries, will the exploration of batteries include distributed storage behind the meter to bring demand reduction benefit to customer and members?
Yes, we're very keen on batteries. I think it's a very interesting technology, and we're all used to have batteries. Everybody's got a phone they're charging up and carrying around, but we're not going to be a first comer to any of this market, and we don't need to be. We're going to take a view of what's going on in other markets, and we would love to have a demonstration project of our own on batteries, a small battery where we charge it and discharge it and watch its behavior. We're trying to understand it. They're very expensive right now. There's a learning curve that goes with batteries that we've observed that everybody expects the price to drop substantially. I agree with that. We saw that happen with solar, where 10 years ago you wouldn't have even thought about solar because it's so expensive, and it's dropped a lot. For us to jump into batteries right now seems probably like the wrong time, because in 8 to 10 years it's probably far cheaper, and we'll have deep regrets about jumping in too early.
That concludes all of the questions I have. If anyone has any additional questions, you can put them in the chat to me very quickly.
Terrific, because I think we're eating into everybody's lunch hour. So
Okay.
we will break for lunch, and we'll begin back at 1 p.m.